good evening to Alan, and anything in between, this depending on the location that you are logging in from. My name is Mia Mikic. I coordinate ARTNeT, and this is the last webinar of ARTNeT in January. And we are very privileged to have again with us Professor Alan Deardorff, who has been a supportive advisor of ARTNeT since 2005 and has shared many good times and with ARTNeT community. And we are very thankful for Alan to be giving us so much of his time and his knowledge, most importantly. So today we are meeting to discuss a very important, relevant topic that I think all of us are monitoring and being engaged on. It is about trade and trade policy during the pandemic. And Alan said that he will be presenting on the causes of trade in terms of spreading the pandemic, or in other words, how trade might have played a role in causes of the pandemic. And what I'm more interested in to hear also how it can be the solution to some of the impacts of the pandemic in the Asia Pacific and around the world. And of course, Alan, being in US and advising US government and other entities there, will be able to give us a perspective also on US role in this process. I'm not going to, introduce Alan's by citing his biodata. We have done that already in the former seminar. For those that are logging in now for the first time, Professor Alan Deardorff career is, so rich, but we are really thankful him for engaging early researchers into the modeling and quantitative analysis, so to support the evidence-based policy making. And through all of his career, he was really a steadfast supporter of that approach. We have posted all the biodata and the link to Alan's personal page, and through that you can discover all the other contributions that Alan has given to the profession through the academia and the policy advisory work. So with this, Alan, the floor is yours, and so please start sharing your presentation now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mia. It's good to see you again. And I'm not seeing anybody else at this point, but perhaps later on I'll get a chance to. Yes, Let me start up my slides.
Alan, just to interrupt you, or while you are putting your slides up, let me, I forgot to say something about the housekeeping rules, sorry. We have been doing this often, so I keep forgetting that we may have some new people on board as well. So what we will do, we will just go through your presentation, and we will keep off camera and off mic everyone else except me and you. And then when we are finished with the presentation and people want to interact, they can turn the camera on. And for those that are on YouTube, we will appreciate you putting your questions in the chat box, and we will find a way to get these questions to Professor Deardorff, so that he can answer those, as well as the questions that are put in the question and answer channel here in Zoom. So with this now, Alan, floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Mia, again, for inviting me to do this. This will be a very different talk than the one I gave last week, which was totally about economic theory and theories of trade policy. Here, I'm not going to do any theory. I'll talk about what some policies are, but I'm not going to say much about what they ought to be, I guess, although as a trade economist, My view continues to be that, generally speaking, the freer the trade, the better. That interference with trade is very seldom a good idea. And I don't think the pandemic has changed that, although it's changed the views of many in the public about that. Let me explain just a moment about what you see in front of you right now. I have been participating with something called NEED, the National Economic Education Delegation, which is an initiative to try to get economists like me, like others, to talk to the general public much more about issues of interest to the general public. And I've already given one talk some months ago about trade and the pandemic. And I've continued ever since then to be paying a lot of attention, and a great deal more attention the last few weeks as I prepared for this, to all the information I can get about how trade and the pandemic have interacted. And I'll actually be giving something like this talk several more times to just groups, interested groups in other parts of the United States. Those will all be more interested in the United States. For today's talk, I have removed a number of slides that I would, that are of more interest probably to the United States, and I'm trying to focus much more on what's of interest all around the world. So that's what this is about, and that's why it is presented in the format and the context of this National Economic Education Delegation. Something you might want to look at their website to learn more about the talks that they've done. And there we go. Okay, so the pandemic. Well, first, just a few things about the pandemic, of course. Now, you know this, but let's just be sure we're all on the same page. It started, at least most people believe, in China, but then it spread to the world in two, or it's beginning to look like three waves, at not necessarily quite the same times in different places, but it's pretty much hit the entire world. It hit the Americas and Europe especially hard. It caused, of course, a lot of people to die. The deaths surged very early in it, and they've continued to go up, of course, the accumulated total of them. But as the treatment to deal with the coronavirus virus has improved, the death rate has declined somewhat, but there's still an incredible number of deaths going on. So there's a place where you can look, and I've copied a couple of slides from there. This is the WHO has a dashboard for COVID-19. I think I may have got a typo there, but anyway, what you see is the growth, the tremendous growth in the number of cases. These are the daily confirmed cases. This is not accumulated. And as you see, we thought it was awful way back in April, but it became a lot worse in July, and then it's become far, far worse still in November and December, and we don't know where it's going, but huge numbers of cases. And as you can see, though, although there was a surge here in Southeast Asia, where most of you, I believe, are, kind of settled down there. It was dealt with better there, but not well at all in Europe and in the Americas, and specifically the United States. This doesn't separate out the United States. The next slide shows exactly the same thing from the same source, but for deaths. And the thing you'll notice there is that it's the same several waves, but the second wave is actually lower than the first. So even though there were more cases happening in the second wave, there were not quite as many deaths. And now deaths have picked up in the third wave again. But the death rate, I think, per case is considerably less than it was back in the spring. So that's just touching on the virus itself. It has led to a bunch of changes in trade policies, and of course that's to some extent what I'm going to be focusing on here. The trade policies, which I will get to later on, have included both policies to facilitate imports, so reducing tariffs and making some other changes to try to make it more easy to trade. But there's, more importantly and more problematically, in fact, there's also been a bunch of policies to restrict exports. Countries have unusually, really, we don't usually expect countries to restrict exports, but they've been doing that during this pandemic. And they've done this on both of these, most for medical things, and not quite that much, but still quite a lot for food items. Facilitation for imports was somewhat more common than restriction, as we will say. And both of them began before the cases themselves even surged. So here's a graph. Simon Evenet had these in one of his publications, where you can see the number of cases is this upward sloping line here. And then we have the policy, the trade policy measures that were related. In green, they're facilitation and therefore sort of good things. And in red, there's restrictions, so sort of bad things. And they just took off really early, back in March, especially for medical items. And the facilitation measures have continued since then to be more than the restrictions, but not a lot more. And the same is true for food, which is a lot less there. Now here is something also from that Evenet source that when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, there's no way I'm going to try to even understand this, let alone explain it here. But I've decided it's sufficiently interesting that it is worth taking a moment on. What this very intriguing and very creative chart does is it shows you how a great many countries have responded with trade policies, whether they were trade facilitation or trade restrictions. If their policies were purely trade facilitation, then their policies are measured along the horizontal axis here. If they were purely trade restrictions, then they are on the vertical axis going up here. And if they're a mixture of the two, they're out here in the middle, as of course a lot of countries are. And then the dimension of the thing has to do with how long the policies were in place. And I can't even read how far this goes, but if they had a clear termination date, then they're out here in the middle somewhere. But if they had a long termination date or didn't have one at all, then they're here at the far end of this chart. And so this group down here on the right shows the countries that had only trade import facilitation measures and that were long lasting, perhaps indefinite. And let's see, what have I got next? Yes, that's describing what they are. This was, if they extended beyond the end of 2020, so into now, they're plotted here. If they ended somewhere during the year, they would have been back here. But as you see, a lot of countries that did this are down here. But, you can't read the labels here, so I looked at, when I blew it up some, and included Canada, for example, is one that's only done import facilitation. So they're one of the good guys, I guess I would say, as a trade economist. Up here, as you maybe would say, the bad guys. These are the guys that the only thing they did was restrict exports. And if they're up here, they restricted exports with policies, measures that extend beyond the end of 2020. So again, there's a bunch of countries up there. That happens to include Italy. It was just one that I picked out that I could see there. And then finally, there's a whole bunch that are doing both. And I can't tell from this really the mix, whether they tend to be more, they're here because they have both kinds of policies extending beyond the end of 2020. That includes India, for example. And that's, I think, the only one that I'm identifying from within there. Now, some of the countries you might wonder about, it turns out, are not in any of those circles, but are up close to that, but not quite there. So for example, the United States, you can't make it out, but they're in here. They're not quite up at the corner. So our export restrictions don't extend beyond the end of 2020, but our facilitation measures do. China is down here, so rather similar to the United States. I guess you'd say. And then Brazil, you could actually see Brazil there, but same sort of thing. So to me, that's a very interesting chart to tell us that there's been a tremendous amount of trade policy response to the pandemic during the pandemic, but there's been tremendous differences across countries around the world, with some only restricting exports, others only facilitating imports, and then a bunch more doing a mixture of both. But you don't see anybody down here. If they were down here, they would have done nothing. I think that's interesting. There's been a lot of policy response. Okay, let me give you an outline for what the rest of what I want to do today. I'll take just a very couple minutes on the causes of the pandemic and the extent to which trade has been part of that. Much more on the effects of the pandemic. I'll look a little bit at the effects on economies overall, but mostly I'm going to focus on trade and other international interaction relationships that aren't necessarily trade. And then some time on the trade policies that I've just alluded to. And then a final section on just the role that trade has played and is playing during the pandemic. So for the causes of the pandemic, does trade cause new infections? Well, of course not. A new infection arises because of mutations, and they often, as we understand it, seem to happen in animals, and then they get spread to humans. And if there's a way that trade facilitates that spread from animals to humans, I'm not aware of it. So I think the answer is no, trade doesn't cause them. But does trade spread it? Absolutely. Trade means moving people across borders, and they carry the infections. And this is not a new thing. Some source that I found mentioned that the Black Death, the bubonic plague, I don't even know when that was. It's a long, long time ago. But it was spread by the trade routes going from between Europe and the Middle East. And it got to Europe, I think, from China. And then a lot more recently, but a century ago, of course, we had the pandemic of the Spanish flu in 1918. That I don't think was spread by trade so much, because trade had been pretty much shut down due to the war. It was spread much more by soldiers coming home at the end of the war and going to their home countries. So not so much by trade. But what about the current pandemic? Well, there have been a few studies. I've only found 2 actually so far, but I imagine there's others going to be done that try to see if there's a relationship between globalization and the spread of this current pandemic. And the study that I've looked at most was by Zimmerman and other authors, and they find 3 things. First, that infection rates do rise. They are correlated with globalization. That is not necessarily saying that globalization causes the infections, but it's strongly suggestive of that, since it's hard to imagine what the alternative line of causation would be. They found that the speed of transmission also rises with globalization. And I think both of these make good sense. What was surprising, perhaps, they found a negative correlation between fatalities from the COVID-19 and globalization. Now, that's probably not a matter of causation. That is because globalization tends to be correlated with higher incomes, and higher incomes tend to mean that the patients can get better treatment and maybe less likely to die. There was another study I refer to there that I think gave results very similar to that. From the first of those studies, from Zimmerman, here is a chart of a measure of globalization and a measure of infection rates, and you see it's roughly upward sloping. The regression line is very clearly upward sloping. Obviously, there's tremendous variation around that line, but that's the positive correlation between globalization and infection rates. And here, same thing for the speed of transmission. But then when they look at deaths, fatalities, they find it goes down. And that's what I referred to earlier, that the higher globalized countries tend to be richer, and they're able to deal with it somewhat better. Not a whole lot better, but a little bit better. Now, let me stress, globalization isn't just about trade, of course. It's about trade, it's about investment, international investment. It's about tourism. Obviously, that's a huge way that people cross borders. It's about international students crossing borders. It's about migration. and just international transportation more generally. All of these things have contributed to the pandemic. So let me turn now to the effects on economies. I'll look at trade, I'll look at FDI very briefly, I'll look at travel, shipping, and supply chains. My complete deck of slides has lots of things on GDP and shortages and other things like that, but I don't have time to deal with those today. On trade, what's happened? Well, very early in the pandemic, as soon as it became clear that it was going to move from country to country, it was expected by the WTO, and I'm sure by others, that it would reduce world trade. And it did, as we'll see. The United States response was pretty typical in terms of its trade, although, as we'll see, China's response about its trade was not typical at all, or at least eventually it wasn't. We'll see that in a moment. Trade with China was, in fact, perhaps most important, and we're going to see that over and over again today, because China is such a major source of many of the things that other countries need in order to deal with the pandemic. So trade with, it really hurt that the pandemic first hit China, because they, for a little while, shut down their trade, and then that meant that other countries had less access to the materials that they needed to deal with the pandemic. Many products were affected. I would guess almost all products, trade in almost all products were affected. The latest thing I saw just a week or so ago in the Financial Times suggested that global trade has now gotten back to where it was before it started. Here's the forecast that the WTO made back in, well, this was reported in June of 2020. And they had an optimistic forecast in green and a pessimistic forecast in red. And they didn't know how it would turn out. In fact, it turned out something like in between those. And it may be somewhat more similar to the optimistic forecast. But nonetheless, certainly trade did drop. This chart, by the way, reminds you that trade had already slowed down its growth after the crisis of 2008 and 9. It never did get back to the trend that it had been on prior to that. Well, will it ever get back to the trend it was on since 2008 and 9? We don't know yet. It's way too soon to find out. The fact that it may, as I'm going to show you in a minute, have gotten back to where it was when this started certainly isn't going to mean that it'll get back to the trend. There's going to be a permanent loss in the amount of trade. Oh yeah, here's the chart that was, it was just January 25th, so 3 or 4 days ago. They had a chart looking at global trade getting back to pre-pandemic levels. Not all countries were the same. Here is a chart of the exports of a bunch of countries. And for most of the countries, you see that after the pandemic reached them, they dropped off and then they came back. But in most cases, they haven't come back to where they were before it all started. And that's true certainly for the United States and Germany, that were big traders and were hit a lot. But it's also basically true for all the countries down here. But then there's China. China really sticks out. They got hit first. Their exports plummeted all the way back in January and February of 2020, but then they came roaring back. They managed to deal with the pandemic better than anybody else, and their exports have risen since then back beyond what they had been before. And it's in fact the fact that China is doing so much better and the rest of us are doing worse that surely accounts for the fact that world trade has gotten back to what it was before. This shows the year-on-year changes, and you can see the drop for China and then a much bigger rise later on. And then for a lot of other countries, the drops that have only partially come back or even continuing to be below what they were a year ago. A lot of trade, I mentioned this before, with China is in personal protective equipment. I said that wrong. It's not the case that most of Chinese trade is personal protective equipment. What is the case is that a large portion of trade in personal protective equipment comes from China. If you look at all products, China's share is down here. If you look at personal protective equipment, it's twice or more that. And that's true for the European Union, it's true for the US, it's true for all countries. So China is central to this whole story. It was from the beginning, and it has continued to be. We need trade with China in order to deal with it. This chart from UNCTAD tells a little bit more about what's been happening to a variety of products, which if you can read it, you could see the changes for different things. Up here at the top is textiles. But basically the message here is that all countries that are included here, what do we have here? We have the US and European Union. Our exports went down in all of these products, okay? China, on the other hand, their exports went up for some of them, and in many cases went down by less than the other countries. And the biggest drop you see here is automotive equipment. Even China had a drop there, but the big drops are the United States and the European Union. So that's what's happened to trade. I should explain this is the first semester of 2020 compared to the first semester, half year of 2019. A lot of this, of course, has improved since then. That's it for trade. I haven't seen a lot of things about foreign direct investment. In fact, I think I have just one thing that I'll show you in a moment. Foreign direct investment fell by almost half for the world, and it fell least, I think, for developing countries and most for developed countries, especially in Europe, where it fell by more than 100%. Okay, and here's the chart from UNCTAD showing what happened to foreign direct investment inflows for these places. Inflows for the world doesn't exactly make sense. It all goes to the world, but you know what I mean. For the developed economies, we're comparing here, where is the labels here. The green is 2019, the blue, dark blue is 2020. So for developed countries, inward FDA dropped by, it looks like 2/3 or 3/4, in fact, it says over here. For the European Union, or I guess this is Europe, not just the EU, it fell, they don't say the percentage because it fell by more than 100%. In 2020, they actually have negative inflows of foreign direct investment, which I assume means some of the investments there are being shut down. For other countries, it's very similar, but not as bad as it is for the developed economies. So foreign direct investment has been hit very clearly, or at least early in the pandemic, the first half of last year, it's been hit. I don't have information on what's happened more recently. What about travel? Well, we all know travel's been reduced. I was hoping to travel a lot this last year, and of course I didn't at all. And that's true, I'm sure, of many of you. We all know travel fell very drastically. It has only partially recovered. And we see this in a whole bunch of things, which I'll show you some numbers for, or pictures. Passengers are way down. The stock prices of the airlines are down. Why is this happening? Well, partly because people are afraid, but also partly because there have been a lot of travel restrictions and border closures. And even when they've been open, there have been increased delays at the border. Perhaps as people were tested when they go across the border. So travel has become more complicated. Here is a chart showing passengers. Now, this is just the United States. This is at the TSA checkpoints in the United States, which you can see in 2019, we're pretty stable all the way along there. Most, I guess, during the summer months, dropping a little bit in September, but basically about the same. In 2020, what happened? Whoa. Shut down almost completely back in April, picked up a little bit in May and June, and hasn't really grown much since June, and certainly is still well below 1/2 of what it was. And this is going all the way well into December of 2019. So passengers in the US anyway are way down. Now this is, I'm pretty sure, this is worldwide. This is passenger revenue measured in kilometers somehow. revenue passenger kilometers. And it's the change from January to November, well, over time here. Again, you see it dropped very quickly and then has crept back up a little bit. And this is showing you for different countries. Interesting for you folks, since you're all in the Asia Pacific, this looks like the one that's recovered least has been Asia Pacific, although nobody's recovered very much. So I guess the fact that you're below those doesn't mean all that much. But yeah, absolutely, passengers are way down, and this is going through November of 2020. So I think nothing much has changed since then in what we've had happen. Of course, this has meant also that tourists are not arriving in places. Tourist arrivals are compared here for January to June of 2019, up here on the top, and for 2020 on the bottom. In 2019, the tourist arrivals went up tiny amounts based on the year before, compared to the year before. For 2020, of course, they went way, way down. The worst was Asia and the Pacific, again, 72%, but everybody dropped by at least 50%. So tremendous drops of tourist arrivals. And of course, you can imagine what that does to all the industries that deal with tourists. This chart I found from the WTO. It's showing something about the number of flights in the world, and you can sort of see that comparing 1 year apart, there's a lot fewer red lines there below than there were up above. Still lots of flights, but far fewer than there had been before. The flight numbers are being charted here in numbers, and this is showing again the same thing. The flights in 2019 rose a little bit in the mid-year and then came down. In 2020, they just dropped to, not to zero, but to about 25% of what they'd been before. And while they've come up, maybe doubling from that trough there, they certainly haven't. They've leveled off, and they certainly have not approached what they were before. What's this done to tourism? Well, here's some charts that the Financial Times had just a few days ago. In fact, it's the same article that I had that earlier chart about trade coming back to where it was before. And this shows you what happened to some aspects of tourism. The reservations plummeted. They came back up, and then people got discouraged, I guess, and they went back down again. Occupancy went down, came back up, and then leveled off. Now, how that works, I'm not sure. Maybe people don't bother with reservations now, but they may then end up doing some traveling. And as a result, the revenue didn't go back down as much as the reservations did. This chart from the same article shows for some particular countries that the Financial Times chose to report on what happened. France looks like they bounced back really well there at first and then went back down again. And basically that's what happened to pretty much everybody that's included here. Some of them had bigger jumps at the beginning, mostly in Europe. In the rest of the world, it looks like it went down and pretty much stayed down without much of a recovery. So that's what's going on in some of the countries with regard to tourism. With much less flying in the airplanes, then of course the airlines were hurt. I got this is for US airlines, and it only goes to July of last year, but it shows clearly the drop in their stock prices. Of course, all stocks dropped, but this brown line at the top is the overall average, which was coming back to where it had been before. And as we all know, it's gone way beyond that since then. The US stock market anyway has actually done better since the start of the pandemic. But the airlines, as of then, were still down, and I think they still are for kind of obvious reasons. Now, what's going on with all of this? Well, countries have been controlling travel. This is a map that you can find for several dates, and so I did that. This is fairly early in the pandemic, March 1st of 2020, and it looks to me, if I'm reading these colors right, nobody had yet totally closed their borders. There's none of this dark brown or dark red or whatever it is. Quite a number of countries had done nothing, but a fair number of countries were doing screening and quarantines and so forth. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through this same map, the beginning of each month. So this was March 1st. Already by April, wow, lots and lots of countries had totally closed their borders. The United States had not, although had restricted things a lot. China had not, but it had restricted things a lot. I can't tell necessarily for where you all are. I can't tell for sure about Thailand there. I think maybe it closed its border. But anyway, by April 1st, a lot of closings, and by May 1st, even more. And then we start reversing that. By June, we start having a little bit of opening up. July, August, September, October, November, December, January. And I did this a couple of weeks ago. January 12th is the closest I get to where we are today. So these border closings, many of them have been relaxed tremendously in the months since. Which ought to make it possible, if people still want to, for people to be traveling more internationally. Now, this isn't even as up to date as we need, because of course what we're seeing now are these new variants of the virus that are popping up and now spreading around the world. And so just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen more closing of borders to particular countries to try to stop these variants from moving. And that's a complication that I'm not sure how these charts will capture. This is not up to date. This only goes to August, but it's showing you again something about the number of countries that are doing various things. Of course, nobody was doing anything back on January 1st. Actually, this says there was somebody that was screening, but anyway, but then at the depths of things back in April and May, everybody was doing something, and quite a lot of them were doing a lot of these bannings, which is what we saw in those maps. But then they've been easing off on the bans, but almost everybody still has something, including screening and quarantines and so forth. Turning next to shipping. Shipping, of course, is necessary for international trade in goods. And so it's been hugely affected as a result of all of this. There was a tremendous drop in trade, and that, of course, meant there was a big drop in shipping to carry all that trade. Now, as things eased up a bit and as trade picked up again, then there was increased demand as countries were restocking. And so there was a pickup in the demand for shipping. But there were restrictions that were imposed. So it wasn't just on the demand side, it was also on the supply side. There were restrictions that were keeping ships from docking at ports or slowing down what they're able to do at the ports. And there were all sorts of restrictions on what the crews could do. They couldn't get off the ships. And so this has complicated things tremendously for the shipping industry. And as we'll see, one of the things that this has led to has been a rise in the price, or the rates actually, for shipping things. I'm going to have several slides where I report headlines. I might direct you, if this is at this moment, to, if you haven't, if you go to my own personal website, you will find a number of things that might be of interest if you're interested in trade. The thing that's relevant here is that for over 10 years now, I have been collecting headlines of articles about trade and international economics related articles in the major international news media: Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, The Economist, and occasionally a few other things. And if you're interested, you can look for everything that I've collected there, and I have links there to all of those articles. Now, in many cases, you need to subscribe to the source in order to actually see the article, unfortunately. But anyway, you can pick out the headlines. And so what I've done sometimes, and I did it here, is I went through there and I looked for headlines related to shipping. And there's too many of them there to tell you, to draw attention to all of them, but I'll just highlight a couple of them. One just back in December, so a month ago, was talking about how the pandemic has caused a perfect storm for global shipping, because it's just hitting them in so many ways. And that in turn is affecting supply chains, which is what's mentioned there. And I'll be touching on again here in a minute. And then this thing about the crews. The crews are trapped on the ships. They're not allowed to get off because the countries they dock at don't want them bringing the virus onto land. And they're getting exhausted and are, well, it mentions despair. So that's been a terrible thing. Whether there's been any progress on that, I haven't seen. But this has been going on for months, and it just must be horrible for the crews, who then, I presume, are not able to ever go back to their homes and to see their families and that sort of thing. Anyway, what's been happening to shipping? Well, here's another one of these comparisons of 2020 with 2019. This goes through the first 31 weeks of each year, because it was done a while ago. But you see a tremendous drop in shipping. Now, it doesn't go to zero by any means, but it's a significant drop. And while there's been some recovery, it hasn't gotten up to what it would have done if it followed the path of the previous year. Notice this is only going into the summer, so it's quite possible that it's normal for these things to rise in mid-year and then fall back down again. And this year it did, or last year it did rise, it looked like, but then it was starting to fall again. Changes in the port calls. This is showing for the different kinds of shipping, which matters for the different kinds of things that are traded. This starts with containers over here on the left, which lots of merchandise, of course, is. And then there's bulk shipping and so forth, and the things that go in tankers and that sort of thing. But the one that's dropped the most is roll on, roll off cargo. I looked up what that is. That's I guess you probably know. It's wheeled cargo. I assume that's mostly cars and trucks, but it also includes railroads, cars and engines, I guess. And I suspect, although what I looked at didn't tell me this, but I assume it probably includes the great big machines, earth moving equipment and that sort of thing. Basically anything that has a wheel that has to then roll off the ships. And tremendous drop in those port calls in 2020. Container trade, this is showing, what is this showing? Over time, all the way back to 2000, they've had their ups and downs. They had a big drop back in the global financial crisis, but they had an even bigger drop in the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? What's this? This is containers again. This looks like what I showed before, and I thought I had taken out this slide, or maybe I've just gotten confused. But anyway, same sort of pattern that we saw before. This is showing what's been happening to the rates. I only found a couple of things like this, but this is the index for putting things in containers. This year, that being 2020, we see a big jump, which they didn't see in 2019. And look at this, again, the same, oh no, not the same, but anyway, a fairly recent source in Financial Times shows container freight costs just soaring here at the end of 2020 and into January. And this is from just a week or so ago. So this stuff that's been happening with shipping is causing the cost of shipping to rise, and some of it just quite recently. So we have yet to see what effects that might have on our trade. That was all shipping by ships, but of course you can ship things by air. I guess it should be called planing them. This too was hurt. But interestingly, for rather different reasons. What's going on with shipping, it turns out, is that a pretty fair fraction of the merchandise that is shipped by air goes in the bellies of commercial aircraft that are carrying passengers. So when passenger flights stopped, they didn't have any place to put the air cargo. And so that caused harm to that. This on the left is showing what's happened to air cargo. For the blue is the belly cargo. And that's the thing that was hit the most. The things that could go in dedicated freighters, those actually didn't get hurt because they could fly the planes, but it was what was going to go in the belly of passenger aircraft that was really hurt. And this thing on the right, I think, is another indication of rises in prices, although I had trouble understanding it. Okay. How important is air for trade? Well, it's pretty important for lots of things. This chart just shows for the European Union, for their imports and for their exports, lists of all of the product categories that are shipped more than 50% by air. And it's not everything, obviously, but you can go down that list and you can see which things are important. The one that got my attention was this one, pharmaceutical products. The things we need for dealing with the pandemic mostly go by air, more than half, 60%, or used to anyway. And of course, we know that going by sea is pretty slow anyway, so I'm not sure we want to go for that, even if it would work. All of this, of course, has implications for supply chains. The next thing I'm going to show you is not really relevant to the pandemic, but it gives you a sense of what supply chains are. And I've had people say they like to see this, so I'm going to show it to you. Over the last, 20, 30 years, as globalization has proceeded, it has created supply chains that are long and very complex. Things are no longer made from scratch. They are made from things, and those things are traded. And those things are made from things that are traded. So just about any manufactured thing that you buy is not going to just come from one place. It's going to come from multiple places. And the idea of supply chains is the illustration I'm going to show you first. But there's also a sort of a horizontal thing where a given product might have many, many inputs that are all put into it at once that come from lots of places. We'll look at both of those things. In any case, supply chains are very vulnerable to all these shocks of the pandemic. Now, here is this a bunch of slides that I was directed to by somebody that people find kind of interesting, an illustration of a tiny little piece of supply chain in the automobile industry. It was relevant for NAFTA, for trade within North America. But I'm sure if you had the information, very similar things could be constructed for all sorts of other products in other parts of the world, including the entire world. The example here is some capacitor, okay, which is made in Asia. The source didn't tell me where it was made, but somewhere in Asia. It's brought into the United States, it's imported, and it's taken to a city called Centennial, Colorado. Where does it go from there? Well, they don't do anything with it there. They just ship it immediately to Juarez, Mexico, where it is assembled onto a circuit board. So already we've got a little bit of trade. It's put onto a circuit board down there. Now, if it was going to go onto a circuit board, why didn't they import it to Juarez in the first place? Well, I'm sure they have a warehouse up here, and they're probably importing lots of other things, and I'm sure there's a reason. Once it's done, put on the circuit board, where does the circuit board go? Well, it just goes to a warehouse. But again, the warehouse is back in the United States for some reason, so it's crossing the border again. Before it is then shipped back to Mexico, another city that I won't try to say, where it's attached to, and you're going to begin to see what this is for now, an automatic seat control, okay? It needs a circuit board. Once it's on that seat control, where is it shipped? Well, it's shipped two places. It's shipped back into the United States to Arlington, Texas, where it is installed on some seats. It was a seat control after all. And it's also shipped to Canada, where it's all installed on some other seats. And then those seats are installed into cars for General Motors here and for Ford up here. That same capacity has crossed the border 4 or 5 times in this little bit of a supply chain. And of course, an automobile has thousands of parts, most of which or an awful lot of which anyway, are going to come from some other country. And in many cases, they will have crossed many, many national borders as they work their way through the supply chain to go into the final good. You can just imagine with these supply chains being so complicated, when trade starts breaking down, of course, the message here had been if NAFTA had been ended by President Trump, then every time it crossed the border, it would pay a tariff. But we have the same problem with all the disruption to international trade for all supply chains. The other kind of example of supply chains isn't things that go from one thing to another, to another, to another, but rather a product that is assembled from many, many parts that come from many places. And I just recently read Ann Krieger's new book on well, trade, what everybody ought to know, I think is what it's called, something like that. And she had an example in there that I've heard mentioned, but she had the details of it. The iPhone, which I have one of, is assembled in China. So we all say, okay, so it's Chinese, but it's assembled from a great many parts. And she reports in the text of her her chapter just the first part of the alphabet of the products that go in there. I won't read them, that come from one of them seem to come just from Switzerland, but most of them are themselves coming from many other countries, and sometimes from a single company that operates in many other countries, and sometimes from multiple companies. So again, that's what supply chains are about as well, is these products that that are assembled into a final product, but have come from many other places. And if you could explore it further, I would bet that you would find that many of these products over here were themselves assembled from parts that came from other countries as well. So that's the world we're living in with all these supply chains. Well, the pandemic's been bad for that. Again, I've collected headlines that have to do with it, but let me point out a couple of things, because one of the things we've been hearing now, and I've been seeing it in these headlines and hearing it discussed, is people are getting leery of these supply chains and beginning to think, oh boy, they're not working so well now that we're having a pandemic. Maybe we shouldn't have done it, and maybe we should undo it. Okay, so way back in May, there was an article about maybe the pandemic will kill off these global supply chains. And just in a couple of weeks ago, The Economist had an article. It's a wave of supply chain reshoring around the corner. Are we going to start bringing the manufacturers back to our country so that we won't be so dependent upon international trade, which can get disrupted? It's been disrupted before, of course, by a variety of things, but it's never been disrupted as badly and as universally worldwide as it has with this pandemic. Okay, even politicians have been getting in there. This guy Kevin McCarthy, he's the he was, well, no, he still is the House Minority Leader in the House of Representatives in the U.S., who's saying that this pandemic's got to start making vital products at home, and that could lead to tariffs to try to get that to happen. What does he mean by vital products? Well, he may just mean medical goods. Or, of course, once you start opening up the possibility of putting tariffs on things that are vital, many local industries are going to say, oh, I'm making something that's vital. You got to help me too. Okay. All right. Well, that's the stuff on trade. What about trade policies? I mentioned them earlier. There's been a proliferation of trade policies. Countries are supposed to report these things to the WTO, and they do. They reported trade-related measures, and this is a map showing something about them as of April already in 2020. This chart shows much, much more recently. It goes all the way through 2020, I think. No, maybe not. Sorry, no, it's just maybe the first half of 2020. But it's showing both export restrictions and import liberalization. And as I showed you in that earlier thing, both of those things have been happening. Let's focus on the effects first on on export policies, then on import policies. For export policies, what do we got? Well, there were bans. Many countries banned the exports of medical supplies. They wanted to keep them for their own people. And to a lesser extent, but still, countries were banning the exports of food because they were afraid they might run out and their people would starve. So lots of export bans were used. Some of these were temporary, but many others were not. Only a few countries had any policies to encourage exports. Most of the export policies were negative, interfering with exports one way or another. Again, I've got some headlines here on export bans. I notice here that China was tightening, this was back in April, but they were tightening their customs checks for medical equipment exports. They make a lot of medical equipment and others wanted them, but they were afraid that they might run out of those things. There were also trade restrictions on food exports mentioned all the way back in April in Reuters. And again, two American politicians, both of whom were running for president a year ago or more, Warren and Booker, they were pressing on the food front that American meat packing companies should not be allowed to export all this meat. Why? Because the meat packing companies, some of them were having to get shut down because of the virus. And nonetheless, the meat packers that were still packing meat were shipping a lot of it overseas. And so they're saying, hey, we shouldn't do that. We should have the meat for us to keep. I don't think it happened, but they were pressing for it. This chart from the International Trade Center shows export measures and how common they were. You probably can't read this down in the explanation, so I made it bigger. The red ones are all export restrictions. 98 countries had them. The green ones are export liberalizations, and you wouldn't have even noticed it was here. There's just a couple of them that did that down in Africa. And then the yellowish things, there's a few that have a mixture of export restrictions and liberalizations. So export measures, absolutely common, and mostly they were restrictions or bans on exports. I'm going to jump through, because of time, a couple of slides here that stress who gets hurt by them. But as you can imagine, whoever you export to is going to be hurt if you don't ship them the stuff. And if it's medical equipment that they need or food that they need, you're going to be hurting them. And those are quite often going to be developing countries. And that was the point of those slides. This one just looks at the export curves on medical supplies, which accelerated. And this is kind of showing over time how it happened. The darkest red, which is the United States, only came in April, but we did do it. Okay. This is showing by type. Oh, right. Okay. I think I'm going to skip that again because of time, but it lists a bunch of types of products that were restricted. And just at the top, I'll mention face masks were refused to be exported to some extent. This is dealing with the time, how long these restrictions were in place. It is a slightly confusing thing because it looks like it's saying that 70% expired in 3 months, whereas 53% didn't have a known end date. So how is that even possible? Well, the 70% was of the 47% that did have a known end date. Anyway, a lot of these restrictions were extended beyond the end of the year, as we saw in that chart earlier on. To what extent did anybody help with exports? Well, these are examples of ones that did, but I looked through it and didn't find anything worth stressing. Let me turn, therefore, to the import policies. Here we have more of a mix. Understandably, countries were much more eager to import. And historically, countries have not been so eager to import. So quite often they have tariffs on products that they now, to some extent, regret. And so there have been some tariff reductions to try to make it easier to get these things that we wanted to get to help us during the pandemic. But there have also been a number of examples of tariff increases and bans on imports, and some policies about government procurement, one of which, by the way, is just in the news, not because of the virus, but our new President Biden is talking about a government procurement tightening up Made in America. Anyway, headlines again. What have I got? Well, very early on in March 16th, the United States was weighing doing some tariff relief because, of course, we'd put so many tariffs on under Mr. Trump. Some people were saying, hey, maybe we ought to take those things off. At first, Trump said no, but in March, just a couple of weeks later, he did suspend some tariffs for 90 days. I don't know what happened after that. He did also a little bit later exempt some of the businesses that were hit hard by the virus from import tariffs. So there were some actions to liberalize imports in the United States and I think in other places as well. But there's also been things happen shrinking imports. And because of the concern that somehow or other that the virus was being spread through trade, and therefore maybe we shouldn't trade so much, I guess. Anyway, back at the end of May, there was a headline about protectionism spreading with the virus itself. Whoops. And one example, certainly related to the virus, is that Guangzhou, one of the provinces of China, banned the import of frozen meat. I don't think it was from everywhere. I think it was from a particular country where they felt they had found the virus on an imported frozen meat. So countries are panicking and doing a bunch of things. Here's, you saw one earlier for export measures. Here's the import measures from the International Trade Center. Again, I'm blowing up the legend here. The import restrictions are not all that common, although you can see them because they're red. They're easy to pick out. The import liberalization is much more common in green. And then there's mixtures of both in that, I don't know what that is, yellow or tan color. So there's been a lot of it. The trade coverage, how much trade has actually been covered by these measures. The WTO gave us this chart showing through June of 2020. No, yes, through June of 2020. What's happened to import facilitating measures. Notice this chart goes all the way back to 2014. So the only part of it that's relevant to the pandemic is this one point here, where there's more import facilitating measures in June of 2020 than in, I suppose, June of any other year before it. So yeah, there was some import facilitation and it covered something like that amount of trade. What about the export restrictions? How much trade did that cover? The WTO reports that as well. Again, it's going back this time to 2012. And you see a jump way over here. Now, most of that isn't the pandemic. The import restrictive measures were mostly due to the trade war between the US and China. So that's why it was up there. The import restrictions continued to be high in June of 2020, but not high compared to the previous 2 or 3 years. Those two charts are a little bit misleading because they both look like they get to the top. So I put them both here and got the scale the same. The number 500 is lined up there with the number 500 here. So now that you can see the trade covered by import facilitating measures was a fair amount higher than the trade that was being covered by import restrictive measures. And even those restrictive measures, at least as reported here, look like they were more due to the trade war than due to the pandemic. Okay, let me turn to what's been going on with trade during the pandemic. Well, it did increase eventually, especially in PPE, personal protective equipment, and also medical equipment. We'll see some charts on these things. The biggest importer was the United States, both before and during the pandemic. The biggest exporter, although not at first, but after a bit of a lag, was China. The trade in face masks, specifically textile face masks, grew the most. As did China's imports of textiles themselves. Even China wasn't making all the stuff that they needed to make the face masks. They had to import them from somewhere else, probably some of the countries that I'm talking to today. And they were doing a lot of that in spite of rather high tariffs in many cases, okay? So here's just the merchandise trade of general and wait a minute, what do we got here? It's medical products, it's non-medical products, but that are related to the pandemic, and then the rest of trade. And what you see here is not much happened until April. But after April, the trade started to pick up in medical products and in non-medical products related to COVID-19. Whereas at the same time, trade and everything else was going down. Not by huge amounts, but it was going down. Okay. The change in trade in medical goods, this gets at which ones were being affected. And this is what I referred to earlier. The biggest jump of 50% was in PPE, personal protective products, which looks like nothing was going on before, because the blue is the first half of 2019 compared to a year before that. If we compare the exports of these COVID-19 critical goods across countries, what happened? Well, it went way up in China. This is the first half of 2020 compared to the first half of 2019. All of these are. And it went down a little bit in every other country, and of course for the rest of the world. So the increase was only in China. We are all depending more on China. Nobody's depending more on any of the rest of us. We're all exporting less of the COVID-19 critical goods. All right. Interestingly, I mentioned China had to import more fabric, and they did. It's non-woven fabric, which is I'm not sure I ever even understood that existed. I think of fabric as being, threads woven, but I guess not. And the face masks, apparently, the good ones, are non-woven fabric. And you can see how those China's imports of that non-woven fabric soared in order for them to make those things. A couple of other just kind of odd things. An article by Ramirez reported that using OECD data, that there was increased trade in counterfeit goods. And this has been a bit of a problem. Defective PPE and defective tests for COVID-19, faulty ventilators and so forth. Even cures, fictitious treatment and miracle cures, to some extent has been traded. I live in the United States, where we had a president that was touting some fictitious treatments and cures. So I don't feel quite as comfortable criticizing those who were trading in it. But in any case, that was going on. And what was provided here was a chart showing where it was happening. They show it mostly coming from China, India, and Brazil to Europe, but then lots of movements within Europe. You see these different arrows. So I never even thought about counterfeit goods being a big part of trade, and I don't know that it is, in fact, big. But it's happening, and it's of course very concerning if it's hurting people. And finally, let me get to vaccines. I, by the way, got my vaccine on almost a week ago. I'm old, and being old is helpful for some purposes, and getting the vaccine is one. Anyway, vaccines are not intrinsically international, but for the most part, a lot of vaccines are going to be made in one country, developed in one country, and then have to be distributed in a different one. So international trade is going to be part of the process. And it's going to come in 3 different levels. First of all, the importing country is going to have to approve the vaccine. The fact that the exporting country approved it doesn't matter to us. We've got to approve it ourselves. Then, of course, we've got to get it to move internationally. It's got to be traded. And then it's got to clear the border when it gets to the country where it's being imported. So trade is actually an essential part of this whole process of vaccinating the world, which we need to do. Now, in big developed countries, they will to a great extent have vaccines they develop themselves, and all of these problems will be handled without trade. But for most other countries, they're going to have to trade. And in fact, for many of us, we're going to need to trade with other countries that manufacture these vaccines. Trade has always been important for vaccines. This is showing you prior to this pandemic, the amount of trade, millions of dollars of trade for human vaccines that grew from $5 billion to 6 or 7 times that over about 15 years. So trade in vaccines has been growing tremendously. This chart shows you where they were being developed. At least I think that's what I understand here. But in order to test a vaccine, you need to have trials, and quite often they run these trials in different countries than where they're developing them in order to get access to plenty of patients to use for the trials. I think that's what this rather messy chart is getting at. This chart, and I see I need to move the headline down because I can't read what it is. Maybe you can, but I've got stuff in the way. But it is showing, oh, I remember what it is, yes. How much of these vaccines have different countries purchased, or had they purchased when this was made? But this is a recent source, so it may be accurate right now. And it's measuring it in terms of the percentage of the population that they have vaccines for. Okay, and the gray is no data at all. The yellow looks like about 50% or less of their population. So as you could imagine, most of the developing world has lined up vaccines for only a minority of their population. This slightly darker green, which includes the United States, it looks like it's between 100 and 200% of our population. And then look at Canada. Canada has lined up enough vaccine to vaccinate over 400% of their population. What in the world is going on? And it looks like the UK is doing the same. So there's going to be a problem. They're going to have to get these vaccines more equitably distributed around the world. And you can see right there that that's going to be a problem. This is how many people have been vaccinated, the vaccinations per 100 people, but the highest they've gotten to here is maybe 4. So far, of course, we haven't gotten very far with the vaccinations. Where are these vaccinations being developed? Well, they're being developed in a lot of places: North Carolina, North America, China, Europe, and Asia and Australia. And that's the lesson of this. They distinguish between confirmed and unconfirmed. I looked that up, and it just means they didn't have a good source for their numbers. This is not so relevant to international trade, but I found it kind of interesting. This is reporting how the populations feel about vaccines. How do they trust vaccines? And the yellow is the people that strongly agree that vaccines are safe. So you want to see a lot of yellow, and you see the country with the region with the least yellow is Western Europe. Only this small amount. The Western Europeans are the most skeptical of vaccines. Since I'm talking to you and you're all in Southeast Asia, or most of you are, you're looking better. You got 61% of the population strongly agree that vaccines are safe. So I'm done. The message of all of this: the pandemic has been really hard. It's had devastating effects on the global economy, although I didn't touch on that much, but very serious effects on global trade and adverse effects on trade policy. How much of these effects are going to be permanent? I can't get into that. I don't know yet. I fear that a fair amount of it will be, but I am done and I'm ready for questions. I've left myself a full, it looks like 2 minutes for questions, but at least I got through my slides. Mia, you have any questions?
Yes, indeed, Alan, we do, and I was like, trying to rush you through the slides, but it was so interesting, and I have to first to say we are in great debt to you for really putting together this compendium of such diverse and useful information to document what was happening through the pandemic. And
Let me just mention, I think I'm going to share the slides with you afterwards, and every one of those slides that shows a chart in the PowerPoint presentation, down in the notes under the slide, it tells the source of the slide, including a link to where you can get it. And of course, you could use the slides themselves if you wanted to.
Well, thank you very much. This is very important. You see, this is what the network is about, so that we actually enable other researchers and analysts to dig deeper in various parts of these, and then to make connections to what need to do at the national or other level of analysis. So thank you, first of all, for that, and thank you for really generously sharing all this material to the network. I do have some questions, and maybe we can spare only a couple of minutes on this one, because I think it's on the mind of everyone in Asia. And I think through Anne Kruger's example on iPhone and many others, Asia is the source, is the hub of the
That's
global
right.
value chains. And through this emotional and other reactions to trade, as you said, we had lots of talk about reshoring, delocalization, etc. So the question is about, what is your assessment on possible redesign of trade channels, trade patterns, and in particular because we have now much higher percentage of different trade through e-commerce, and also trade in knowledge-based services, in digitally enabled services. And so, what do you think about a pattern between manufacturing versus services trade, and where are we going towards in next couple of years or so? Back to
Well,
you.
I don't know, of course, where we're going in the next couple of years, but I worry about it because I think the political incentives to to raise trade barriers is we're seeing a little of it already, and I think we're going to see more of it. I would love if the United States would take the lead after it did, as it did after World War II, in liberalizing trade, but that's not going to happen. We've gotten away from Mr. Trump, but that's moved us to the Democrats, who've never been in the post World War II era very positive about trade. And so it's just not going to happen that he's going to be lowering tariffs. And I fear he won't even lower many of the tariffs that Trump put in. He may do a few of them, but probably not too much. And he's already made some noises about tightening up our Buy American provisions for government procurement, and that's going to be popular with his base. And I understand that, but I think it's regrettable. And I suspect, to some extent, the same sorts of things are going to be happening in other countries as well. So I'm afraid the policies will certainly not move us towards more open borders. Now, fortunately, borders are currently still pretty darn open. And so the question, if we don't tighten things up too much, the question then will be whether the companies that are doing all this trade are going to feel they need, for their own protection, to pull their supply chains back in closer to home. I think they won't. I think they're going to realize that the efficiencies that they've derived from this specialization in many parts of the world, and to some extent by taking advantage of low wages in other parts of the world, they're not going to be willing to give those up. They'll look at the options and they'll decide we just can't afford to do that. Instead, we're going to have to find other ways to protect ourselves from future pandemics, things like stockpiling, holding greater inventories. That's going to raise some costs, but I don't think it will necessarily interfere with the sourcing that we've so gotten used to. I think the supply chains may diminish a little bit, but I think not all that much.
Mm. Thank you, Alan. I think that's a sort of enough optimistic answer for Asia to cling on. Just one comment, because there were heaps of questions hinting towards vaccine nationalism and vaccine protection, and it looked like towards end of 2020 that countries were not so much into it, but now the more recent news have, particularly from Europe, have awoken those sentiments. Any comment on that? And in particular, could trade policies that are more coordinated help in any way in that regard, or is it squarely sort of health issues?
I don't see a role for trade policy except to I think we can easily get countries, as we maybe already have, to agree to promise not to restrict exports of vaccines. A number of countries already did that for medical equipment and so forth. So I think countries will be willing to say that. But of course, what we're getting into is now that they're rolling out the vaccine in at least some places, all one hears now here in the United States is all these people saying, "Hey, how come I can't get the vaccine? What's wrong? Why am I?" Now, what can I say? I got it myself because, but it's going to be months before many people are going to get it. Before most people will have access to it, and during that time, an awful lot of people are going to feel very grumpy. And if they hear that vaccines are leaving their country, they'll complain about that, and it's going to take strength on the part of those running the medical companies, the vaccine companies, and also for their governments to resist that. The pressure will be there, but I'm hoping most of them will manage to resist it because they will realize it's just wrong. You cannot keep all of this for yourself. So we'll see.
But Alan, there is another argument there, because it is not only that the vaccines have to be, some of them have to be produced where they're originated, but of course people can share the patents and the formulas. And the question is, what are we doing about actually enabling those that can produce vaccines locally and distribute it? And do we have a role through TRIPS, and do we have to roll through some more solidarity versus making profits of the companies only?
Really good question, and I remember now that I saw that touched on in some of my reading, and then I just kind of ignored it, and I shouldn't have. Right now the TRIPS agreement helps to enforce the companies from not sharing the formulas or whatever it is for their vaccines if they don't want to. One could imagine an agreement like they did for what, AIDS, malaria, and TB, was it? That they might do an exception there and make it okay for countries to copy the vaccines. But I don't know technologically if that's even feasible. If Pfizer doesn't want to share how they make their vaccine, can somebody in India reverse engineer it? I kind of doubt it. So I think they'd need the cooperation of Pfizer to do it, I suspect. And if that's the case, then a WTO exception wouldn't make any difference. So I don't know the technology well enough for that.
Right. I think that's a debate. I mean, that's a topic for another webinar, actually, because there is this argument that it was public money that contributed to development, and so whether it is Pfizer's, and I don't kindly audience, mentioning of any companies doesn't mean any endorsement or any other meaning. It's just for the example purposes. So for the individual company. So this is the balancing of the social and private sort of cost and benefits and all of that. And typically in the TRIPS, in the intellectual property area and trade, we have always had that argument, and
that's right.
And I don't think we have solved it still sufficiently, because we only managed to give some sort of a policy space to the least developed countries. But in terms of the global pandemic, I don't think that is satisfactory, and I think we need to maybe when WTO gets a new DG, and maybe when we have some sort of momentum starting there, maybe we will have some action as well. So I'm afraid there are more questions, Alan. I will collate them and pass them on to you, and it is.
Okay.
I'm sure that if you find some relevant, you will try to answer through me or directly. But
Yep, please do that.
meantime, I thank our participants for being with us in this very interesting, very seminar that has, or webinar rather, that has provided such wealth of information. So thank you very much, Ellen, because you have put it together very nicely for us. So for everyone, thank you so much.
Excuse me, Mia. Excuse
yes,
me.
Pitada? Yes.
Sorry, I have some important announcements.
Yes,
Allow
please.
me to share the screen, please.
Yes. Okay. This is sorry, this is from my team. I was not, this is, oh.